You know the story of David and Goliath, but few know that the giant felled by the young shepherd had brothers. 4 brothers who swore vengeance against the man who dared defeat their older brother. Picture the scene. After the stone lodged in Goliath's forehead, the battlefield fell silent, and the Philistines retreated in shock. But far away in Gath, Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Lahmi, and a 4th brother, whose name isn't mentioned, but whose physical characteristics struck fear and terror into Israelite warriors, heard the sound of that fatal blow. They couldn't accept Goliath's death. They prepared retaliation plans and sharpened their weapons with one goal: to annihilate David and prove that the name of the giants could never be humiliated. Today, you'll discover how these 3 colossi emerged from the shadows, how David, now an older man marked by battles, rose to face them once more, and why this hidden story is a powerful portrait of how we can face our own inner giants. Get ready to learn details that most study. Bibles don't even mention and understand why this revenge almost became a nightmare for the people of Israel. To understand this unusual revenge, we need to go back several years before David's confrontation with Goliath. The stage for this story is the city of Gath, one of the 5 main Philistine strongholds, a people who descended along the Mediterranean coast, dominating part of Palestine's coastline. The Philistines weren't just brute warriors. They were skilled city builders, masters of metallurgy, and practitioners of a religion that worshipped gods of war. In Gath, stories circulated about a family of giants, descendants of the Rephaim, whose name, Rephaim, means giant or one who causes terror. Goliath, the most famous, stood nearly 10 feet tall and wore complete bronze armor, helmet, breastplate, greaves, and a spear that looked like a tree trunk. But Goliath wasn't the only heir to this lineage. His brothers Ishbi-Benob, Saph, Lahmi, and the other one who had 6 fingers on each hand and foot, shared not only the imposing stature, but also the fierce temperament and pride of belonging to an almost mythical lineage. While Israel lived under Saul's government and later David's, the people felt disgust and fear toward the Philistines. Great walls surrounded cities like Gath, Ashdod, and Ekron. Sacred temples rose in honor of the god Dagon, and gigantic warriors kept the population in constant alert. It was in this context of political and military tension that young shepherd David emerged, coming from Bethlehem, sent to bring provisions to his brothers in the army. The biblical narrative of 1 Samuel 17 that everyone knows describes the single combat between David and the giant Goliath. But few pay attention to 2 Samuel 21, where we read, "Once again there was war against the Philistines. Then David went out to defeat the family of Rephaim." This expression, family of Rephaim, refers to the descendants of Rephaim, the same lineage to which Goliath belonged. Among them, Ishbi-Benob, whose Benob indicates gigantic stature, Saph, whose name refers to weakening or tearing apart, and Lahmi, which literally means my bread, perhaps alluding to the brute strength that sustained the fame of Rephaim's heirs and the 6-fingered giant. Imagine the impact of this news. After bringing down Goliath with a stone and sling, David became a national hero and king of Israel. However, the traditions of Gath never forgot the humiliation suffered. Instead of mourning their brother's death, they gathered in silence, forging weapons, sharpening spears, and swearing revenge. Each of them was described as being as large and strong as Goliath, perhaps even faster and more cunning, having learned from their brother's own fate. In this context, it wasn't just personal revenge. It was a matter of honor, of keeping Gath's prestige intact and terrorizing the Israelite army again. When news reached David's palace, he was already beginning to consolidate the unified kingdom of Israel, but nothing prepared him to face, again, not 1, but 3 giants thirsting for blood. This historical setting shows that we weren't dealing with a simple duel between hero and tyrant, but a clash between peoples, cultures, and spiritual powers. On one side, the confidence of a man anointed by God. On the other, the fury of clans who saw themselves as immortal through stature and family tradition. It was a grey morning in the valley of Elah. The Israelite army was gathered on one side, and the Philistines, with their champion at the front, on the other. The air vibrated with the sound of war drums from both nations. Suddenly, a cutting silence. Goliath, a colossus of nearly 10 feet wielding a spear thick as a tree trunk, advanced to the center of the field and let out his thunderous challenge. With each word, his hatred and contempt for Israel penetrated like blades into the soldiers' hearts. David, still a boy and shepherd of sheep, watched the scene from afar. He felt in his heart that this wasn't just a duel, it was a clash between spiritual forces. Without armor, like a defenseless man, he presented himself to King Saul. His only defense would be his sling and 5 smooth stones taken from the stream. As he approached, Goliath mocked, "Do you come against me with sticks and pebbles?" But David responded with unshakable confidence. "You come against me with sword, spear, and shield, but I come in the name of the Lord of hosts." With a breath of faith, he launched the stone, and the blow was perfect. The stone found Goliath's forehead, penetrating his bronze armor. The giant staggered and fell with a crash, as if the very ground had rejected him. Goliath's fall echoed like thunder. Philistine soldiers fled in panic. The Israelites, previously terrified, advanced with shouts of victory. David, with Goliath's blade, cut off his head. The prophecy that God would give power over enemies was fulfilled there before everyone. But what comes next, few tell. The battlefield calmed, and the young hero was hailed as liberator. He walked through ranks of exhausted soldiers, collecting broken armor, witnessing the general ecstasy. Each stone in the stream, each breath of faith, had transformed that moment into a watershed for Israel. When the echo of victory still vibrated in the valley, rumors began reaching Gath. The giant was killed by a boy. Mockery turned to shame. Torches on the walls flickered, reigniting the ancestral hatred of Rephaim's descendants. 4 shadows stood out, Goliath's brothers, each larger and more furious than their fallen brother. This sequence of events, which many books only mention, in footnotes, launched the curse that would take David, now king of Israel, back to the valley years later. It was there, among bones and abandoned spears, that the cry for vengeance from that lineage was reborn. And it was also there that David, now an experienced man, wore not just armor, but the firm conviction of one who already knew the power of the Almighty. And it's about this rematch that we'll speak, how Ishbi, Saph, and Lami rose to recover. Gath's honor and the confrontation that almost cost David his life for the second time. Ishbi Benob, the first to emerge, was described as tall as a watchtower, and so strong that a common spear would barely scratch his armor. His name carried the echo of ancient battles. Witnesses tell that he, still young, faced 10 soldiers at once and survived. Now, enraged by Goliath's death, he promised to kill David with his bare hands. Soon after came Saph, whose name suggested tearing apart. If Ishbi was brute force, Saph was lethal strategy. It said he studied each of his brother's battles, understanding his strengths and weaknesses. He gathered a personal guard of Philistine deserters, men experienced in ambushes, and planned to surround David in a narrow passage with no escape. Finally appeared Lami, my bread, a giant whose breath was so powerful it frightened horses. Tattoos of ancient symbols revealed his priestly origin in Gath. Beyond strength, he carried rituals that, according to those fearing the god Dagon, brought supernatural protection to those of his lineage. One more brother was still lurking, and just mentioning that he was the 6-fingered giant was enough to leave Israel's army in terror. Upon hearing that David was preparing to consolidate the throne in Jerusalem, The three brothers gathered. In a hidden camp beyond the hills of Hebron, they planned revenge. It wasn't just a military attack, it was a ritual of honor, a blood ceremony to restore Rephaim's glory. Meanwhile, David, now king, spent his days in state councils, governing Israel. But he received news from a messenger. Giants were approaching, marching south, leaving footprints in the mud that gleamed with steel. The court trembled. No one dared duel with these colossi. Even surrounded by officers and soldiers, David's heart trembled upon hearing each brother's name. He remembered his sling in the valley of Elah, but now the challenges were different. Not one, but three giants plotting his downfall. This imminent clash would mark the moment when faith and strategy would meet again. But how each duel unfolded, and how David, despite the odds, triumphed for the second time. In 2 Samuel 21:15-17, we have a glimpse of what's to come when David decides to face these furious and fearless giants. After years of victories, King David was no longer the young shepherd who had challenged Goliath with a sling and 5 stones. Now he carried the weight of the crown, battle scars, and the weariness of days. But the wars weren't over yet. The lands of Israel were again in conflict with the Philistines. It was as if a curse hung over David's lineage, for Goliath's spilled blood had awakened the fury of the giants' brothers, and the first of them would come to claim revenge, Ishbi-Benob. More than a warrior, Ishbi-Benob was a monster thirsting for blood, a direct descendant of the Rephaim, a race of ancient giants cursed since primordial times. His spear weighed more than 7 pounds of solid bronze, and he wore black armor that seemed to absorb light around it. His eyes, soldiers said, burned. With the same hatred that had consumed Goliath in the valley of Elah, Ishbi-Benob didn't fight for glory, but for revenge. He sought David's blood, and for this he marched against Israel with a single mission: to kill God's anointed. During combat against the Philistines, David, already aged, insisted on going to the front lines. His men warned him, "You are the lamp of Israel. If you're killed, the light will go out over us." But David couldn't hide. The same heart that faced Goliath drove him even now in weakness. And it was in this weakness that Ishbi-Benob saw his chance. At a moment when David was exhausted, isolated and wounded, Ishbi-Benob found him alone on the battlefield. The giant smiled. It was the moment he had awaited for years. He raised his monstrous spear, ready to pierce the king's body as if it were a simple piece of wood. The sky darkened. Time seemed to stop. David fell to his knees. His strength was draining. Was this the end? But before the spear fell, a cry tore through the battlefield. Abishai, son of Zeruiah, David's nephew and one of his most loyal warriors, appeared like a divine arrow. With the fury of 1,000 battles, Abishai launched himself against the giant. The combat was brutal. Ishbi-Benob roared like a beast from hell. His blows made the earth tremble, but Abishai didn't retreat. As if a supernatural anointing strengthened him, he dodged the spear, struck with his sword, and cried, "You come with strength and size, but I come in the name of the Lord of hosts." With a final blow, Abishai pierced the giant's heart, making him fall like a tree before divine wrath. The ground shook when Ishbi-Benob fell, and a sacred silence took over the field. David, fallen, looked at Abishai with tears in his eyes. He knew his life had been spared, and that the war against the giants was just beginning. The land of Gath, Philistine frontier, began whispering rumors. A new giant had emerged. His name was Saph, another descendant of the Rephaim, Goliath's brother, molded by the same ancestral hatred. But unlike Ishbi-Benob, Saph wasn't just a brutal warrior. He was a strategist, silent and patient, an assassin who liked to lurk, study the enemy, and attack when the advantage was certain. The elders of Gath said Saph was born with his eyes turned to the sky, as if challenging God himself from the cradle. He didn't just want to avenge his brother's death. He wanted to destroy Israel completely. His target was the throne, and his first mission to kill David's most faithful men one by one. While the people of Israel breathed after Ishbi-Benob's death, Saph planned a silent massacre. David, still recovering from the previous attack, gathered his mighty men trained in the fire of wars, forged in faith and sword. Among them was Sibbecai the Hushathite, little spoken of in the Bible's pages, but feared by enemies. He was a natural hunter, specialist in hand-to-hand combat. Sibbecai heard about Saph and felt in his spirit that confrontation was inevitable. In Gath, the armies of Israel and the Philistines met again. The battle was bloody, but different from previous ones. Saph didn't attack like a brute, he moved like a shadow, and when he saw Sibbecai, he advanced. The duel between them was a dance between light and darkness. Saph carried a spear with a curved blade and used two smaller swords strapped to his back. His body was agile, his mind strategic. But Sibbecai carried more than skill. He carried the favor of Israel's God. When they met on the field, there were no words, only stares. Saph attacked first with a sequence of swift cuts. Sibbecai defended and retreated. The giant was fast, and more than that, he was cruel. Low blows, attempts to wound legs and eyes, he fought like a beast without honor. But Sibbecai remained firm. At one moment, Saph wounded him in the leg. Blood gushed. Victory seemed near for the giant. But then Sibbecai fell to his knees and prayed. The enemy mocked, but it was at that instant that heaven's answer came like fire. Sibbecai rose, steadied his sword, and in a quick and precise movement dodged Saph's final charge and struck his neck with a sure turn. The giant's head fell with a dull thud. The soldiers around fell silent. Another of Goliath's brothers had fallen, and the people of Israel knew the Lord's hand was still with David and his warriors. Now we dive into the third and perhaps most controversial battle. The name of Goliath's third brother appears in 1 Chronicles 25 as Lami, and in 2 Samuel 21:19 there's a variation that for a long time confused scholars. But the truth is that Elhanan, one of David's mighty men, fought one of the most brutal battles in biblical history against this colossal warrior. Chronicles 25. There was war again with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, killed Lami, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Lami wasn't just a warrior. He was a living legend among the Philistines. Known as the one who never fell, he was the oldest of Goliath's brothers. According to tales from Gath's soldiers, Lami survived dozens of wars, defeated multiple kings, and was trained to kill from childhood. He was larger than his brothers, stronger, more relentless. He carried the same colossal spear with weaver's beam shaft, symbol of the Rephaim, but also wore reinforced armor with black plates, made with lion leather and bronze scales. And there was something more in him, a silent fury, a thirst for blood that could only be quenched with someone's death, David's. But David no longer went to wars. And who took his place was a young and promising warrior named Elhanan. Elhanan, son of Jair, was from Bethlehem, same city as David. He grew up hearing stories of the shepherd who killed Goliath with a stone and faith in God. Inspired by this trajectory, he trained from childhood with the hope of one day protecting his people as David had done. Elhanan wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. He was known for one thing: his fearless heart and his precision with the sword. As lethal as an arrow, his blows were quick and deep. When Lami appeared on the battlefield marching against Israel, no one dared face him. But Elhanan stepped forward. The confrontation happened in Soko, a border city. Israel's army was positioned, but tension was palpable. Lami advanced alone, challenging anyone to face him. The sound of his armor clanking resonated like war drums. Elhanan entered the field. Lami smiled. "Another son of Bethlehem? Don't they ever learn?" The fight was a clash of generations, the old and deadly giant against the young and faithful warrior. Lahmi's blows were devastating. Each movement made the earth tremble. But Elhanan was agile, stalked like a lion, dodged like a wolf. For minutes that seemed like hours, the combat continued. Elhanan was wounded in the shoulder. Lami lost part of his helmet. The fight was bloody, and the sky seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a moment of distraction, Elhanan spun, fell to his knees, and with a sure movement pierced the side of Lami's armor exactly where protection was weakest. The giant fell, falling face first to the ground. Elhanan, bloodied, rose and shouted, "The Lord is the God of battles, and he has delivered another into Israel's hands." 2 Samuel 21:20-21. There was yet another battle at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, and he also was descended from the giants. When he defied Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. He had no name mentioned in the Bible, only a disturbing description. He was known by the Hebrews as the son of abomination. They said his presence caused nausea, that his eyes burned like embers, and his skin was thick as oxhide. But what really set him apart and made him a harbinger of terror was the number of his fingers, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. In that era's culture, physical deformities were often seen as marks of curse or possession. And this giant, more than any other, seemed to carry within himself the symbol of something diabolic. He was the youngest of Rephaim's descendants, the youngest, yet the cruelest. He didn't seek just to kill. He enjoyed humiliating, torturing, and blaspheming against God before Israel's armies. But from among Israel's men, someone rose, a young warrior, until then unknown. Jonathan, son of Shimei, David's brother. In other words, Jonathan was David's nephew. And as David faced Goliath years before, now Jonathan would face the most terrifying creature the Philistines had ever produced. David was already old, far from battlefields, but the king's blood still ran in his nephew's veins. And when the giant insulted Israel's God and cursed Yahweh's name before the army, Jonathan couldn't contain himself. He drew his sword and, without waiting for orders, ran toward the monster. The crowd fell silent. On one side, a young warrior without renown. On the other, David knelt in the center of the silent field, certain that it wasn't his skill, but the Lord's power that operated in each victory. Just like him, you too have been called to defeat your giants, not with your own hands, but with faith that moves mountains. If you felt the weight of these lessons, leave an amen in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that no obstacle is greater than the God who cares for you. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more stories that reveal the extraordinary truths of the Bible. Until the next revelation.